everyone, and welcome to another episode of At War, a podcast by the Conflict Law Center. Today we have with us Director Policy and Research Shumaila Khan from Digital Rights Foundation and Noor Vahid, Senior Research Associate from the Digital Rights Foundation as well. And we're going to be talking about an issue which is very, very current these days, which is social media and its link with conflict and war generally. So I talk about social media all of the time because I got off it earlier this year, and all I keep on telling people is that it's incredibly morally corrosive, it's the worst thing, it's the best thing I've ever done is getting off it. But looking at it in the context of armed conflict, social media has expanded and developed so rapidly in the last 20 years. And we're seeing right now with the Russia invasion of Ukraine that it's being called the world's first TikTok war, which is that, users are spreading information in real time on that platform, especially because it's the only one that the Russians haven't really blocked. So is social media really as revolutionary as big tech likes to claim it is? Because even with the Arab Spring, they kept on talking about this being a social media revolution, Twitter revolution, Facebook revolution, that type of thing. Or is it not as powerful as it claims to be in terms of do we really just need analog real world events and it can't compare to what's happening in cyberspace? How important is it?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it is incredibly powerful, but it's not the kind of powerful that a lot of tech companies and governments claim that it is. And I think it has to do with the fact that there is this false sense of hope or sort of optimism that this is something that both either the tech companies or member states can contain or sort of fully understand the nuances of. And I think that's the kind of issue that has actually led to a lot of conflict, because either there is an overestimation of its power or an underestimation at times. So I think it sort of depends on the context. So when the Arab Spring happened, I thought it was sort of that reading of it as sort of solely being led by social media was a bit patronizing to sort of the kind of organizing that had happened, because social media is a part of it. But there's obviously a larger sort of socio-political background. So I think there was an overemphasis on the role of social media there. But when it comes to other sort of spaces where social media has had a disproportionate or outsized sort of hand in perpetuating the conflict or flaming sort of hatred or against a particular ethnicity, and we'll talk about specific examples as well. But over there's been an underestimation, or I think platforms have failed to take responsibility for how much sort of the platform is perpetuating that kind of violence. So there's always a misunderstanding, and I think it also has to do with who the people being affected are, because when it comes to, for example, Ukraine, social media companies were very quick to respond. There was very concerted effort. Policies were temporarily sort of changed in light of the context. So, for example, Meta said that anybody sort of even threatening violence, for example, statements such as kill Putin or death to Putin would be completely allowed on the platform, which normally these kinds of statements are not.
Okay.
So that kind of. And that is the kind of double standard that a lot of countries also talked about, because when it came to, for example, the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, there were a lot of issues. For example, we were in touch with journalists who had their accounts suspended because the kind of approach that Meta took was that any conversation regarding the Taliban was not allowed. Despite the fact that it might be people or local journalists actually condemning or sort of talking about the atrocities of the Taliban in order to sort of bring to light those things. And
wait, so even that wasn't allowed?
Unless it was newsworthy.
But even then they failed to identify when it was newsworthy. So, for example, Meta was entertaining cases where they took down content where people had talked about like, oh, the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and they flagged that content as like violating their dangerous organizations and individual standard because they because they mentioned simply by mentioning Taliban.
Right.
So I mean, but of course you're not glorifying them or like speaking in favor of them or anything, but just by mentioning them, automatically their algorithm just took it.
And
down.
often these were instances of people condemning it and actually grassroots people. So for example, Dawn, which is sort of a verified organization, can talk about the Taliban, but the line between sort of journalists obviously is so thin now that you can't just have news organizations talking about a particular issue. You have to allow for that space. So that was a very like sort of unnuanced, heavy-handed sort of way of dealing with that conflict. And when it came to Ukraine, because there was so much pressure, they had more people sort of thinking about this, more experts who were thinking about this, and that led to a much more nuanced policy there, where it comes to any other conflict, you don't see that kind of, and you see that in Myanmar as well, what happened. And I think at one point when sort of the Facebook was being sort of used for sort of genocidal hate speech, I think they only had 2 local language content moderators. I think this was around like 2014-15, so very, very recent. And civil society in Myanmar was sort of were screaming themselves hoarse, sort of talking about this issue. But at that point, there wasn't any kind of like sort of
So for me, it kind of comes down to 3 entities which use social media. So it's the state, which kind of wants to retain a kind of monopoly on the use of it, and so wants to stop it. Like Russia, it took off Facebook. I think it took off Twitter or blocked a lot of Twitter, and then and then people were using proxy sites. But it allowed TikTok because obviously China is kind of in cahoots with them in terms of not condemning their actions right now. And then you have the role of big tech and what that does. So for me, the idea that they're allowed now to say kill Putin and you're changing your rules according to that, how is that nuanced? How is that allowed when you're not allowing in other ways? And even when it comes to the Taliban, why can't you go on Twitter and say that you support the Taliban or that you support what they're doing? Right now they're officially they're de facto the state, right? And they won, which is what I just keep on going back to. 20 years, you were there, you tried to do whatever you could. Even then, the kind of things that the US was responsible for in terms of giving warlords Viagra, knowing that they were going and using that Viagra to rape young boys just so that they would be, allied with the allies at that point. It's just, I'm like, who decides in big tech? Why should we allow them to decide? And then the third point, which I want to go on to later when we talk about ISIS, is non-state actors and their use of social media. But when it comes to Facebook, when it comes to Twitter, when it comes to Meta, I'm like, these are inherently, for me, evil companies. And I want you guys to talk a bit more about what happened in Myanmar, what happened with the Rohingyas. And even when it comes down to it, the people who are doing the content moderation are paid, I think I read $1 a day, and they're watching all of these horrible videos of beheadings, of things that you wouldn't really want to watch, and apparently they have trauma from that and stuff. And those are the people who are moderating the content for these agencies, and I just think the entire system is completely flawed. So when Facebook then comes out and says that it has policy, also because they're watching us all of the time. One of the reasons I got off social media was because I was reading reports about how Instagram actually would turn on your front camera to watch you, and Facebook kept on getting sued in American courts for allowing that to happen. So I'm like, how much power do we give big tech in moderating this content? Who is watching the watchers? That is basically the question.
So I guess the primary problem with why do we let social media companies decide what gets to be on the platform? Why can you not get away with supporting the Taliban or saying like certain things, even if they won? It's because, ultimately, this is the public-private distinction, right? Facebook is not, or Meta is not a government, right? It's not a state, it's not the UN, it technically doesn't have any real, legal obligation to protect those rights because it is just a private entity, any more so than like a nuclear weapons manufacturer has a moral obligation to like not.
So it just cares about its bottom line.
So but now here's the interesting thing though, right? Because the bottom line depends on people being able to use that platform, feeling safe and not being like victim to all these crimes. So if you were going to like get traumatized by using Facebook because you saw an ISIS beheading or you saw like child pornography or something, then people wouldn't want to be on the platform. They would boycott it, and then like Facebook is a free service, right? Like they make their money through ad revenue. So for that has certain implications for them, which puts a monetary incentive on them to uphold certain human rights standards. Also because then governments also have the then onus to boycott them, ban them, because they're like, well, you're letting child pornography and like copyrighted content and a lot of like vile shit, kind of perpetuate on your platform, so we can't let you function. Even if you are a company, you are providing a service, we are not going to allow your service to run in this country. And as we've seen in a lot of cases in Pakistan, in Europe, in Australia, in a lot of places, in Russia, they have the option. The government has the power to ban these platforms. So ultimately, this is destructive for their bottom line. So that does give them that onus to do better in terms of human rights.
It is interesting because then you're saying that the state does have that sense of oversight over what big tech does in some way. When the YouTube ban was on in Pakistan, everyone was watching YouTube by proxy, or they would download. There is really no way to stop social media now. It's so big.
There is, because here's the thing. We benefited, people who were accessing these websites like illegally without the consent of the state, so to speak, because there was a sort of lack of digital literacy, right? So previously VPNs or like using LimeWire to pirate software, like governments did not know about these services. They were niche comparatively. They were open to a younger generation of people. But then progressively, as this information became more and more mainstream, governments became aware of them, and they were like, oh, this is something that needs to be controlled. So like with VPNs, like the government of Pakistan, they are presently in the process of having VPNs registered. So what makes VPN so special, which is like the power to be anonymous, the power to override certain government restrictions, like that power is effectively being like curtailed by the government. Because now they're aware of it. Like I mean, back then,
and even with the Gulf, with what it does with WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram.
Also, like sort of your ability to use a VPN depends on how much bandwidth you have. So if you're someone who has poor connectivity anyway, you won't be able to use a VPN anyway because it slows down the internet for you. So I think that it does significantly impact. And I think platforms, just to add to what Noor is also saying, is that there's also something that isn't spoken about a lot, is that there's a fair bit of sort of data sharing and sort of give and take between states and private companies as well. For example, we know that the Israeli government has had a lot of leeway with a lot of social media companies with regards to sort of removing content. There were backdoor meetings. And if you're a state that doesn't have that kind of financial or sort of political clout, then you won't be. So we saw, for example, in India that a lot of content, for example, the head of actually Meta in India had to be had to resign ultimately after whistleblowers spoke about this, but because they were sort of leveraging sort of content by the BJP and hateful content.
Really?
So there was a lot of like sort of political influence being
and even the way they curtailed the use of the internet in Kashmir, especially during the COVID, and doctors were like, we can't download any medical guidelines, like we need to, and we just don't have the internet to do that.
I think there's a fair bit to be sort of, that debate needs to, it's not as clear cut, like because we're always given this kind of binary between either the company or the state. And here in Pakistan, I think we err on the side of like sort of the company taking those decisions, because we're a lot less sort of comfortable at times with the government, because there's sort of that immediacy where, as with the company, there might be some safeguards and checks and balances. For example, a lot of private companies do now submit themselves to some sort of oversight. For example, Facebook, Meta has the oversight board where its decisions are binding. The ambit of the oversight board is quite sort of limited, and it's only limited to, for example, content moderation decisions, not sort of regarding data privacy, which is where the actual
board members are not Meta people, which is the most important
it's independent.
thing.
Where are they from?
They're journalists, professors, people who would have academics who would have topical knowledge over the content in question.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
But there are also like other sort of, and for example, the GNI principles is something that
What is
a lot
that?
of companies, they're sort of these general sort of, I forgot the acronym actually, but like these are voluntary principles that all major tech platforms have signed themselves up for.
So like the UN guiding principles on business and human rights.
Yeah,
like
those
that's
are also, so these are these kind of frameworks where companies sort of voluntarily submit themselves to.
But they're
certain
entirely
transparency.
toothless.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
for example, the GNI principles or sort of they have led to strides in somewhat of transparency. So the
From the
transparency
companies,
reports that these companies, they're still not enough, and that's something
Yeah.
that we criticize them on.
Because
But
even
now
when I
we know-
read the BHR guidelines, I was like, this is entirely pointless.
But-
And also, like, it's kind of a whitewashing as well, because it's
Yeah.
like corporations will sign up to them and be like, oh, look, we're so human rights friendly. And it's like, ExxonMobil, like, really? Are you? You're going and, like, killing people in Indonesia.
you can say that about any international human rights.
But also, I mean, that's true, but it's like, for me,
You know how I feel about it.
yeah,
Really.
for me, I'm just like, big tech is definitely evil in such an insidious way that when you look at 1984 and when you read 1984 and you think about what an Orwellian state would be like, you think about it as something which is not insidious in the way that we have it right now, right? It's like something which is in your face, it's glaring, you know that you're in a fascist state. But I think that the way social media goes about it is that you're so tethered to your smartphone. I even, my parents, like when they're reading WhatsApp forwards, like there is so much disinformation going around, but at the same time, the democratizing element of the internet is still present, right? I mean, when you see TikTok and when you see some Mazdoor in Balochistan getting like millions of followers, you're just like, wow, this is the most amazing thing about social media. And then you look at especially Generation Z, I mean, I don't stop talking about it, but these smartphone tethered Zoomers, their rates of anxiety, their rates of depression, everything is just skyrocketed the minute you allow people to upload photos and get rated for them when they're a teenager. Like, it's just not something that I will, all they care about is having a captive audience. And for that, the ways in which we have become, the ways in which we've become a captive audience are so much more insidious than what we thought it would be like under a fascist state.
I think there's sort of, we haven't really caught up to the fact, and our legal systems and regulatory systems sort of, you're absolutely right about like sort of human rights principles regarding like companies, because they're still sort of assuming that the model of making profits is the same. For example, sort of there'll be sweatshops and if we can sort of make that supply chain fairer, whereas we're in a completely different sort of economic system now, which some people call like surveillance capitalism, where the ways in which data is being extracted and the ways in which our daily lives are being monetized and is not being sort of reflected in the kind of sort of regulatory mechanisms. So we're trying to apply sort of those same regulatory mechanisms, which work at times. For example, demands for transparency are very important, and we need more. For example, if you read like Facebook's transparency report 6 years ago, and now there's a lot more information that you get, for example, in terms of state requests and things like that. But we still don't know what kind of state requests, what kind of negotiations were happening, how are algorithms taking decisions in terms of content moderation, how are algorithms extracting data. But so I think sort of perhaps some of the regulatory mechanisms and I don't want it to be like sort of very Western centric, but I think there's a lot we need to look towards, a little bit towards Europe more than the US, because for example the GDPR does more than any other sort of legislation, and especially in like sort of the Western world. And for example, the new other rules that are coming out against like sort of AI regulation of artificial intelligence needs to be sort of explored. The problem with these kind of frameworks is that they're very Western centric, and they and obviously there is this Brussels effect where whatever happens in the EU has to be adopted like sort of worldwide, and more so with internet regulation, because there's a uniformity, like you said, that it's very difficult to sort of control those data flows. But we really need to, like for example, the digital service Services Act, which I think was probably last week is where like it became effective, which has a lot of safeguards regarding like human rights audits that companies need to do. So a lot of these reports that are coming out, for example, regarding Myanmar, or couple of weeks ago regarding sort of Palestine and Israel, where there was an independent audit of Meta's language, sort of Hebrew and sort of Arabic content moderation within the region, and it was sort of found that there was indirect discrimination that was happening.
So can you tell me a bit more about that, like as in Myanmar and what's happening in Israel Palestine?
Yeah, I can, and you can also add. Sorry, I'm stopping.
No, please. Like Shmaila has like literally nearly a decade's experience in this industry.
But we, for example, in Myanmar, the Facebook. So Facebook recently, there were a series of reports. Meta put out its human rights report, which was heavily criticized because it didn't give you enough information, but it did sort of talk about specifically human rights audits in India and Myanmar. And the Indian audit there was a lot of smoke and mirrors, but with Myanmar, there was finally an acceptance of responsibility where it was, because what happened in Myanmar was that they went from like zero connectivity to like almost 100% connectivity.
Oh, really? Okay.
And because of the way sort of the internet evolved, Facebook became the default internet. Like sort of people.
But that's because you get it for free.
Exactly.
It's like even in Pakistan, you get
Free
Facebook
basic,
for free.
yeah,
So
exactly.
you're providing, and this is why I always like have this question when people who work at Facebook are all like, oh, there is a right to use the internet. There's a human right to the internet. And I'm like, of course there is, because that just serves your bottom line. You're giving, and especially in developing countries, like I remember seeing the billboards, right? And it was that use internet for free, you get Facebook for free.
And in the US, for example, they're lobbying for free sort of net neutrality, but they're doing the opposite in the rest of the world. Hypocrisy there as well. Because
completely.
Facebook was putting in so much money for lobbying for net neutrality because it served their purpose there. But here you have this like sort of pioneering program. In Myanmar, it's sort of, and at the same time when there was, and connectivity also sort of when it's gradual, it's a lot more normal. When you pump in the internet without any sort of regard for
or like giving them the tools to like distinguish between say disinformation, misinformation, the dangers of the product, because Facebook does call its platforms the product. Right, if you read their audit report, it does call it a product.
It's a business,
It is exactly right. Those skinners will just say, but like they never. But the ordinary people, they don't know. They don't know what these risks are. They're just told, like, here's some crack. Go for it. This is
and it's actually apparently like crack, like being on social media, like the dopamine hits. And also because I've been doing a lot of reading about social media to, like spreading it. I'm not on social media. I've read all about it. It's like, because half the time you go on it and you don't enjoy what you get. So apparently when you give a rat dopamine every time, like when it pushes the lever and it gets that, it knows that it's getting it every time. But when it's a mixed bag, it's obsessed, because sometimes it gets the dopamine hit, sometimes it doesn't. That's why you keep on checking again and again, because you don't know whether you're going to get the hit. It's so much more addictive. Like when people talk about it being a slot machine in your pocket, I'm like, it's 100% like that.
And withdrawal symptoms is people get like social media
completely.
withdrawal.
But when you're talking about digital literacy, what do you mean?
So digital literacy, I mean, one, in Pakistan, I guess if you're talking specifically in Pakistan's context, it is one linked with actual, very literal literacy. Because if you cannot read, it is obviously a lot harder to be active on the internet.
But I thought that's the amazing thing with voice notes.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but it's not limited to that. Because the visual nature, because I mean, voice note, it's a mic, right? Like these symbols are basically broadcasted to us all the time, that you can identify like, oh, this is a mic. And every platform, if you've noticed, every platform uses the exact same symbol for everything. So the message symbol is the same. If it's a bubble, it's a message. If it's a little mic-y thing, there are different types of mics, right? It's always the same symbol, because obviously they have that visual association with people who are not literate, right? So like you said on WhatsApp, why is WhatsApp so popular in a country like Pakistan? Because you don't even need to have basic literacy to use voice notes. But but digital literacy caters to issues like, for example, we had like a consultation recently in which people brought up like, oh, like people in my community, they don't have the highest literacy, but they're like, oh, people in my community, they've been getting messages from like a bank saying that if you
Yes.
send me your PIN, you will get, or like Benazir income support system is going to give you 12,000 rupees if you give me your bank account number and your like PIN and your email address and your phone number, and these people fall for it.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So
I know people who've fallen for it, and it's like, oh, please send me like 1,000, then it's 2,000, and it's 3,000, and they're sending more because they're anticipating that they're going to get a windfall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like, so digital literacy basically guards against like those ills. So like, knowing that like phishing is a thing, right? Like knowing that people can scam you, knowing that you should never like convey this type of information to someone, knowing that like the information that you're sending from one platform to another is not encrypted, not always encrypted, it's not always secure, and there is a third party, whether that is a server, whether that is the cloud, whether that's your internet service provider, whether that's the government, that they have access to this information. So it's not as one-on-one as if it were if I told someone a secret or gave them a physical note and that note was destroyed. Right? So digital literacy basically, gives people the information and gives them the awareness that if you're going to use a product, these are the dangers that are associated with it, and these are like and how people can lie, right? I feel like culturally we have this thing like where if you see something in print, it has legitimacy, right? Because before this particular era, anything that you saw in print, it was hard to get things in print. Right now, anything can be in print. You can be your own publisher, and that is what tweets do. That is what Facebook does. That is what these
and a lot of people, for example, don't know basic reporting, like sort of how to report on the platform. Like a lot of times, things can be sort of harmful content can be removed just if you know how to report it to the particular platform.
But they can't even identify if it's harmful, right? They can't tell if a picture is photoshopped or doctored.
For example, Pakistan Meta recently sort of published I don't know if it was published but shared with us that Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I think India account for 80% of sort of sharing of child pornography in the world.
God.
And I think Bangladesh was probably also like I'm sort of blanking on the particular countries, but it was South Asia in particular. And the issue was not that there is a propensity for sharing child pornography. People would, for example, share child pornography not knowing, for example, just to raise an issue like, look at this, unknowingly, knowing that this also violates this also violates the dignity of the child, because every time you share it, it's a re-traumatization. So all of and a lot of people, for example, last year there was a spate of like suspensions of very high profile accounts as well, because there was a case where this a child who had sort of uploaded a video himself, sort of because he was sort of being molested in a madrasa, but there wasn't that digital literacy to sort of for other people to say if we're raising this issue as like this is wrong, we shouldn't be sharing the content, or we should be sharing it in a way that doesn't constitute sharing of child pornography, because and their accounts got suspended. So that kind of basic safety measures, I think, is also sort of really missing.
And like, so going back to the Rohingya Muslim thing, right? Like another thing is like Facebook and Meta, these social media apps, they're such a unique product. It's not a product that stays static, right? And takes on just one form. It varies according to the geographical context, right? So what Facebook's platforms or Meta's platforms are in Pakistan is very different from the way it's used, the way it's consumed, the way people react to it, the way what people know about it in other countries, right? So in the Rohingya Muslim case, for example, this is where there's a shortcoming on part of social media companies, in parts of governments, in part of the user, and that is that they don't know what to do if something is in a different cultural context. At the end of the day, these are American companies that are selling a product that is variable and varies according to whatever culture or context it is injected into. So with the Rohingya Muslim case particularly, one of the shortcomings that Meta themselves acknowledged was that there was a language barrier, right? And there's certain words, and I remember we were having this conversation the other day as well, where there's some words, like, where do you draw the line, right? Because there's some words that are slurs, but they also have very benign meanings in like regular language. So one of the words that people in Myanmar were using against the Muslims was like, I've forgotten the word, I think it's kalar, which is both a slur for Muslim, but it also just literally means chickpeas. So like how do you flag that kind of content? And like Shumaila mentioned, like prior to like in 2014 and prior to all this happening and coming out, they only had like 2 human content moderators, and like you can imagine the volume of information that they have to sieve through, right? And like, how do you know, like, you know, is this benign? Is this just like your mother's chickpea recipe? Like, do you want to make hummus? Like, how do you decide that, right?
To add to rules, sort of, for example, in Pakistan, a lot of people who are typing are probably not using the Urdu or Arabic script. They're using English script to talk about, and the spelling variations are. We were trying to do a research on sort of Farsi and Pashto and sort of content moderation and Dari, and we were looking at like sort of how certain words were not being flagged, and our researchers came back to us and they're like, you need to define those words for us because there are like 10 different ways to spell a different word just because of in Roman and in English. And it sort of opened up, and if you don't have local language experts, if you don't have local sort of experts, researchers, academics in every context, and it sort of, for example, if like a company is to locate to Pakistan, they would have like, for example, like a dedicated team here. But Facebook can be used anywhere. They don't have to have any dedicated staff anywhere in the world. So and you have to really push these companies. Like for example, Pakistan didn't have like with a lot of companies, it still doesn't have a policy head. Dedicated to Pakistan. So you don't know who to talk to. There's no one sort of thinking about these issues. For example, we have elections coming up next year. What are these companies doing? Do they have a dedicated self? Like in the US or when it comes to Brazil or India, they have these dedicated, like, for lack of a better word, I don't know what they call them internally, but like reporting, they call them like war rooms for like different countries where, you know, they're crisis centers where they're constantly dealing with issues. Economies aren't like ours, probably won't have that. And this will probably be sort of, if 2018 was like defined by social media, this time around it's going to be even much even more. And there's no preparedness because these companies are not willing to invest and really sort of think deeply about these issues. And
our governments are also a little bit deficient, right? So for example, like in other countries, like I said, the product varies according to country, right? And they do have to adapt to like the local laws of the country. So for example, in America, if you have like a political campaign, you are like by law required to disclose that this is a politically sponsored, or this post has been sponsored by the XYZ campaign, right? In Pakistan, we don't have any such provision, right? And we should, like, that should be in the ECP, right? But these weren't problems that were exactly anticipated because this is like, we were all living through this age for the first time.
In the last general elections, we were monitoring some sort of violence against like women politicians, and something that wasn't part of the research, but what we found was that in sort of within ECP's laws, you have to, before 24 hours before the polls, you have to stop campaigning. So you can't do like rallies, I think. But on social media, everybody was posting. And there were Facebook lives, there were Instagram lives. PTI was having like sort of campaigning, hashtags running. And this was part of the recommendations that we also gave the ECP. You don't have any monitoring for social media. If you're going to have a code of conduct for everything else,
every other form of broadcast media, why social media?
We're sort of few months away from the elections if they happen on time, and there's still nothing. We haven't really heard anything.
I do wonder though about where regulation will lead us. Like even when you look at the 2016 US election, there was so much scapegoating about Russia and Russian bots and how much influence they had over the election. So it goes back to the point that you were making that, you know, sometimes it's really overhyped, sometimes it's really underhyped, like we don't really know. And also, for me, the question is who regulates, but then it's how do they regulate? And it, you know, going into the cultural context and going into how many moderators you have who understand it, but also what should actually be moderated. So I was looking at how ISIS recruits, and apparently they have like an incredible social media campaign. And apparently they use Twitter to recruit the same way. They use social media to recruit the same way that Taylor Swift sells her music albums. And I just thought that was incredible. Like they are really using and leveraging this platform. So to what extent do you go to regulate, and what do you regulate? You know, because now Donald Trump is off Twitter. That's actually when I got off Twitter. No, that's not what I got off Twitter.
That's completely true.
But you know, when you're just like, why?
If Elon Musk comes back.
Exactly. I was reading about Elon Musk as well the other day that the CEO of Twitter was like, please, can you stop tweeting things like, is
About
Twitter
negative
dead?
things
Yeah, because it's really not
That was an
helping.
incredible conversation,
Yeah,
just by the
exactly.
way.
But why is Donald Trump not on Twitter? Why is he not allowed? And you know, how are these policies being made? Who's involved? And really, it just comes down to, even when we look at the Russia-Ukraine thing, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of countries who have sympathies with Russia, who have sympathies with Putin. That is not the reflection of the Western consensus about this, right?
Yeah.
And so when we're looking at how social media posts by Russians are getting interpreted compared to how social media posts by Ukrainians are getting interpreted, I mean, a Ukrainian could then call for death to Putin, and a Russian couldn't call for death to Zelensky,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, that's not fair to me. So how, like, where's the line? How do we decide the line? And who's looking at how we decide the line as
So
well?
I feel like it's interesting because, like you said, like, why do these social media companies get to decide, right? But when we ask for more regulation, what we're also doing is inadvertently we're telling them, we need you, social media company, to lead us, right? You are giving them
Exactly,
more power
yes.
by being like,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
you
yeah.
need to be accountable, you need to do more, we need more transparency from you, right? Because now we're kind of in this quasi-abusive situation with these like tech companies where you're like, I hate you and I want to leave you, but it also has to be you. You are the overlord, you are the savior, you have to do it, right? But like at the same time, I guess the unavoidable truth of the matter is that these are American companies, right? Like at the end of the day,
Apart
they
from
are
TikTok.
going to, well, like apart from TikTok, I bet you could say death to Zelensky on TikTok. I'm sure we could say that. If America wasn't their biggest market. Again, you know, then you have this issue of this was trending. Well, it would never trend in America because no one would let it fly, right?
Yeah.
But also at the same time, if it was, the American government would just ban TikTok. And if TikTok is like, oh no, but our largest consumer market is in the US, then like we can't afford for them to be pissed off at us. So we are going to, put in the safeguards that's going to prevent. Like we don't care. They really don't have very intense like personal moral stakes in these conflicts. They just have like again the bottom line. But like for the largest part, I feel like they just reflect the cultural, moral, and political attitudes of the US. That is something across the board, like you said. Why can't you say, like, what if you do support the Taliban? What if you're an Afghani citizen who says that this is the best thing that happened to my country?
And when you look at a non-state actor, it's like for 20 years, that was something which is stigmatized, which is taboo. They're now the state. Right, so they're now running the show. You left with your tail between your legs, and now what do you control about who says what about the Taliban? It doesn't seem to make sense, right? And just knowing that you are at a point of history where you don't know in the future who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and I feel like like trying to look at them in a very like Manichaean duality way of like, you know, these people are good, these people are bad. Because we don't like Donald Trump, he's bad and he gets to get deplatformed regardless of what he's saying. It just seems like this is too much power to be giving to big tech entirely.
But at the same time, you have like platforms like Parler, right? So now what it's doing
I don't know what Parler is.
So there's like a
You're lucky.
so you're gonna be like, I want to join this if you didn't know. But like basically Parler is where all the canceled people go.
Oh,
so
okay.
It's basically a social media which Kanye is buying, by the way.
Okay.
Kanye wants to buy Parler. So that doesn't tell you all you need to know about what Parler is. But basically, this
I love
again.
that we just to interrupt you, we've discussed both things.
It was fate, I'm telling you. We were like joined together, star-crossed lovers. But yeah, no, you have again at the end of the day, these social media companies just give you this decision. If you don't like our policies, you're a free individual. You don't live on social media. You are not a series of bytes and a currents that you're like, my life is only on social media.
Right.
If you are an actual individual, if you want to go into your actual town square and scream that I love the Taliban, you are welcome to do that if your country lets you, right? However, if you don't like it on our platforms, we are again a private company, so get off our platform if we wanted. So there's this new thing. It's called DALL-E, which is this artificial intelligent like art generator, which I got to play with a little bit, and I noticed something very interesting about it, and I wondered if this was the future of social media, if this was the only plausible way to like avoid all this conflict. And that is that on DALL-E, the terms and conditions of that particular platform or interface is that you cannot put in anything, you can't talk about political figures,
Oh.
Any political figures, whether it's Obama, you can't write Obama and Hillary Clinton shaking hands. It will flag you.
Oh, okay.
And you have
Okay.
they have a 3-strike policy. If you have 3 strikes of violating their content, your access is removed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is very powerful technology. Like you can make any image just from like a few verbal suggestions. So the abuse potential for this is tremendous, right? You could make child pornography,
That's
violent, gratuitous, like
Right.
real, visceral images. And what they've done is you can't talk about any body parts, nothing sexual, nothing gory, nothing bloody, nothing related to any war or conflict, and nothing related to any political figures or politics. You
Okay.
can't. Those are the rules of the
Right,
platform.
right,
And
right.
when I was using it, I was like, is this the future of social media?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
this
I
where we
wonder.
need to be as a platform?
Yeah,
That we're like,
totally
fine,
benign.
don't
like,
talk
yes.
about no death to Zelensky, no death to Putin, no anti-Israel, no anti-Palestine, nothing. You can just talk about your mother's chickpea recipe. There is no confusion. It is
Yeah,
just
because
the
you can
chickpea.
still sneak it in,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
That's the
What is
thing. You would be
political?
able to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how do you define what is political?
I mean, like human beings are so inventive. Like we
Terrible.
will create.
You'll find a way to be
Yeah,
terrible.
we'll create ways. I'm so sure.
Yeah, and especially in like different cultures, I would imagine it would probably fail because what is political in the US context would be very different here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but, that would also, but I think
And
sort of
time, right? Like for example, people give these social media companies a lot of flack for being like pro LGBTQ or whatever, right? But like even in the history of the United States, like 50 years ago, that wouldn't have flown,
Yeah.
right? Facebook or Twitter or whatever would not have allowed for like that kind of content to exist on its platforms because it would have probably violated some
Yeah.
community morality clause or something where they'd be like, this violates the morality of our platform. So we don't know. In another 10 years, like we have all of world history to see that even, for example, the communists, right? The communist revolution in China, the CCP, right? They were not formally recognized, right? The government of Taiwan was recognized as the official
Yeah.
Chinese government,
Yeah.
and slowly that veered away to the CCP,
Yeah.
and now they are the authority. All the Western powers. When we say China, that's the government that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So we don't know in like 100 years and 50 years, maybe like no, you can talk about the Taliban positively because those are the people
Exactly.
you interact with,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
I mean, look at Japan.
yeah.
They used to be, like Koreans
big
and the
daddy.
Chinese would never go there. Yeah.
I think sort of adding on to what Noor was saying, like sort of this question of the kind of power that these platforms have. I think a lot of times the way that we approach and the regulation that approaches it is like sort of a band-aid on like sort of the larger problem, which is why are they so powerful?
Yeah.
Which is that their profit model has been allowed to they've been allowed to consolidate more and more capital. They've been allowed to sort of completely sort of take our data, and a lot of the regulation is not sort of getting at that issue. It's just trying to sort of either solve the content moderation issue, transparency issue, but the problem is that these platforms frankly need to be broken up. And
Right,
they need to
okay.
be, sort of there needs to be
Shamila. She coming in with that antitrust. She's like,
no, but like it's the
them.
way
Yeah.
that they acquired for
Instagram,
even when-
WhatsApp,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
It was very like sort of monopolistic practices, but they were allowed to happen because regulation in the US, there was this sort of at that time like the US government really benefited from the fact that these companies are creating surveillance software that you
Yes.
can use sort of
Yeah.
right after 9/11 for other
Yeah.
things. So Google, for
Totally,
example,
yeah.
which was very prominent in like sort of like this history of surveillance capitalism, but had contracts with the US State Department using that same kind of technology. The NSA was learning from them.
Yeah.
Their statements sort
Yeah.
of within the NSA that we need to learn from these tech platforms on how to accumulate data. So they allowed these companies to do whatever they want, and now they're sort of in a fix. What are we supposed to
Yeah,
do?
And they have so
nobody's-
much money now that they're like,
Yeah,
even if
that
you
they
are
can't do
to
anything.
cut
Yeah.
them off, like they
Yeah.
have a lot of resources to have like a complete independence.
Yeah.
Like for example, between sort of even the Obama administration, so we fought like sort of the Bush sort of time as like this sort of with the rise of surveillance and surveillance capitalism, but even within the Obama administration, there was a revolving door of like people from Google,
Yeah.
from Facebook,
Yeah.
were advisors very close to the administration. So ultimately when the reckoning happened and like Mark Zuckerberg had to go, that was also sort of a show and a performance where they just sort of humiliate him. But Facebook still exists. Nobody's messed with its profit model. So I think there needs to be sort of that kind of, you need to wire. These companies will remain powerful if we don't get at that issue, and if we keep saying अच्छा अब आप ये एक extra चीज भी कर लें, अच्छा पहले disinformation was not a problem, now define disinformation yourself. And these companies, the way that they operate, like they'll do like a short consultation, and they'll get like cultural experts from across the world, and but there's no obligation on them to do to listen to these people. And obviously, as Noor was saying, like sort of this is such a nuanced problem. You can't have a one size fits all issue, and these companies don't want to sort of give away power to other people, or sort of have more and the problem is, if they have more localized sort of, for example, if there's a localized Facebook, that would ultimately be controlled by the state, so then we're back to the same
I get what you mean.
There's this tussle going on, and I don't know where this will land.
And also, like, they're again, like, these companies have also benefited from the fact that lawmakers have no idea what technology is. Like, lawmakers are so old, they're so outdated. वो अभी तक fax में भेज रहे हैं अपनी सारी चीजें अपने assistants को. Like, they're really struggling. So like, Facebook, well, Meta is sued for like their acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp, and Department of Justice ने उनके खिलाफ केस किया था पूरा, and that's still ongoing, I believe. They haven't come up with like a decision on that, but if that would be a historical decision if the Department of Justice like wins that case.
And we saw that when Zuckerberg was being questioned by the Senate, like they didn't know how to. They didn't know how to question him.
But also at the same time, like these companies are benefiting from the fact that they like. People don't know what these products are. So what they say is that we did not violate any like we have not participated, indulged in any anti-competitive practices, because every single app that we own is different. Right. So as long as we're not like, buying out the competition, so how would you define the competition? As a social media app? Or is it like, no, but Facebook is like a community app, and Instagram is a picture app, and WhatsApp is a messaging app. So there are three different products, right? How do you define that? Before now, we've never had to think about this. The law, this is a loophole in the law. Like the law has never had to accommodate a product that can simultaneously be defined as one thing, obviously, or as three different things. And that's like the fight going on right now.
Very interesting.
Ongoing, like, and these people have the money to litigate endlessly.
Yes, of course.
And even in Pakistan, like sort of the Pakistani state has fundamentally misunderstood like sort of social media, where, for example, the Section 37 of PICA gives like unfettered powers to the state to block content. So that's why we had that circus of TikTok being banned 4 times within the span of 1 year, 1.5 years, which is ridiculous if you think about it. And now it's back, and it's like sponsoring PSL, so I guess that's will never go away. But the other problem is that also sort of the solution that a lot of states, like for example India and Pakistan, have like similar sort of a regulation now, where they now are asking these companies to relocate their offices within the country, so they can be bound by the laws of the country. And companies have resisted this so far, because what happened in India with Twitter was during the COVID wave, which is really sort of deadly, and obviously there were a lot of people who were expressing outrage against the Modi government, and I think the Indian government sent in some content for Twitter to remove, and they refused to remove it because it was legitimate criticism of the government. They ended up actually raiding Twitter's offices and sort of also trying to hold individuals criminally liable, so employees criminally liable for what Twitter was doing. And that is exactly the kind of regulation under the social media rules that Pakistan has brought in. And so far it's being challenged at the sort of Islamabad High Court is sort of where a lot of these laws are being challenged, but that's the kind of like sort of where, that's why we always say like you're sort of stuck in like a rock and a hard place. Like either it's these companies or it's the state completely misunderstanding what social media is, and they're not defining if the regulation regulation was to narrowly define, for example, child pornography, hate speech, which is very, very narrowly sort of incitement to violence, for example, those could be sort of where the line is drawn, and everything else then can be, have specific legislation. It doesn't have to be criminalized. There can be other ways to accommodate it. Maybe you can have with these companies a shared panel or some sort of shared body where you can give advice to the companies. The government could invest that kind of resources with civil society sort of involved. You could have a co-regulatory mechanism that doesn't criminalize speech, because the problem with speech is that if you sort of take the blunt instrument of criminal law, it's going to then we see what happened with Pika, where sort of Section 20 was used to arrest, and still is being used to arrest journalists, go after people, and especially in a country like Pakistan, that becomes a bigger issue. So I think we need to think creatively, but whenever our lawmakers think of social media, they're like, या तो इसको बंद करो, किसी को जेल में डालो,
full power होना चाहिए, हाँ सब कुछ देखें.
I think that's a good point to end on. Let's break up big tech. Let's share responsibility over what happens on there. Everyone get off social media. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and I hope you join us for future ones as well. Thank you.